thank you for joining us for the last panel of today's Longevity Forum. We heard this morning about the extraordinary progress that's being made in bioscience in curing the diseases of aging. This afternoon, we heard about the endless possibilities that await us if only we adjust our long lives, both professionally and personally. And as we live longer, the definition of what makes a good life obviously changes, and how we adapt to that change will determine whether we end up living healthy, fulfilled, and long lives. So, to discuss this topic today, on my panel, I have Dame Esther Ranton, who founded, among other things, the Silver Line, a charity which plays a key role in tackling loneliness in older age. Pamela Druckerman, author and contributor to the New York Times, whose latest book, There Are No Grown-Ups, sheds light on midlife transitions. Got Dr. Eliza Philby, generations historian and expert, who will talk today in particular about the challenges of millennials and also Generation Z. And I know also you have an alpha generation also on the way, so we'll talk about them as well. We've got Robert Rowland Smith, the author and philosopher, who will talk about challenges of being human in the era of 100-year life. And we have Marie-Elsa Bragg, who is an author and a priest, and who will offer a perspective on how we support ourselves spiritually as we live longer, so how we take care of our souls. I'd like to open the panel by asking each panelist what will make the biggest difference to the quality of life as we live longer. If I could start with you, Esther.
Righty-ho. Can you hear me? You can, that's very good. Well, I was desperately trying to think of ABBA, but I've only got as far as ABBA. I better actually explain myself. I am 78 years old, and 78 is the new 78. Okay, so because it's quite ageist to say 78 is the new 38, isn't it? So we've got to be a bit careful here. Ageism, obviously, we've talked about this. It's odd, isn't it? I was brought up, my grandmother very sensibly, excuse my sexism, my grandmother very sensibly had 4 daughters, and all the daughters lived within about 3 miles of her, and I saw my grandmother every weekend, and she was the heart of the family, really, literally, she was the loving heart of the family, and she was irrationally crazy about the children she met and the children in her family, and she was loved and respected and admired and included, and she was the sun, and we circulated around her. And that's how I was brought up, and it ain't that way now, is it? Very often, older people find themselves isolated, and I'm sure we will talk about that a little later. So ageism, which happens within families, which happens in the media, which happens in employment, which happens occasionally in an excellent forum about living to be 100, where the various tables stop at 75. Can I just say to your excellent photographer, could you not take photographs of me while I'm talking? Because I've noticed for some reason it makes my teeth look big. But I can pretend to talk. Would you like to? Okay. But then there are the 2 Bs, and they're burden and busy. And we've had, in less than 5 years, we've had 2 million plus calls to the Silver Line, and the word our callers use is burden. They do not want to be a burden. So they talk to us about their feelings of loneliness. One lady said, I'm an optimist by nature, and often I have to be, as I face another pointless day when I'm a waste of space. Oh, God. That's how she feels about her life. She told me that her husband had died of cancer 5 years previously. Her son had died of cancer. Her daughter lives locally and visits her 2 or 3 times a week. But she's busy. She has her own family. You know, the supermarket checkout assistant is busy. The neighbours are busy. God knows the doctor's surgery is busy. So it's busy and burden. She doesn't want to burden her daughter, and her daughter is so busy. So if we could get rid of ageism, the feeling that among older people they don't want to be a burden, and the busyness of our lives today, then I think that would be a major step forward.
Thank you. Pamela, what do we think about midlifers? What would make a difference to their quality of life?
I mean, for me, when I reached midlife, it was, this is going to sound a little bit less dramatic now, but this kind of big question mark of what is this era? What's happening now? I think there's first a sort of, I live in France, and there was a kind of physical shock where all the waiters within the course of about a month went from calling me mademoiselle to calling me madame. So there was kind of no escaping the consensus view. And there was kind of a shock that I was now in the generation that was considered the grown-up. And I realized, I'd reached the point where, when I thought someone should really do something about that, that someone was now me. So what for me was important to sort of understand this time of life was to define it. And I started by looking at the science. And I realized very, very quickly that there was some good news, that there is no point in life when all your powers are peaking. There's no day when it's all just coming together. People in their 20s are much better at remembering names, at processing information, but as I think may have been mentioned a little bit this morning, in midlife you're better at this kind of crystallized intelligence, at having emotional intelligence, at having empathy, at really understanding other people. You're less neurotic, which kind of clears the channel so that you can tell what's going on. And I think that is one of the big pleasures of this period of life. And one of the joys of it is you can finally sort of uncover what's happening. The static goes away. The Buddhists say that just simply knowing what's happening, knowing what's going on around you is the aim of life and the great pleasure of life. And you can sort of do that in midlife. And the other thing that's also a bit existential that I discovered in my research is that in your 40s you start to become who you are, that you see yourself more clearly too. Jung talks about the process of individuation, that from 0 to 40 or so, you're ruled by your ego, you're doing what your parents want you to do, what the society expects you to do. And in your 40s, you hit a wall with that. And you're forced to confront who you really are, who you're really attracted to, what you're actually good at. And I saw, as I kind of spoke to a lot of people who were in this stage of life, I saw the struggles that they went through where they said, I'm really never going to write that novel. Or, I'm really not attracted to men. Or, and so there's this struggle as people individuate. But then you see when they get to the other side of it that I noticed, certainly in the late 40s, that there's a period of kind of calm and pleasure and acceptance.
What do millennials think about this, Eliza?
Well, I, for one, am looking forward to being less neurotic, for sure, as I get older. So we've heard a lot this morning, I thought was quite interesting. Several people mentioned the way in which, and these were said by older people, baby boomers, saying how invigorated they felt to be surrounded by young people. And yes, that's true. Being around young people and having children absolutely keeps you young. But it also runs the risk of infantilizing the young themselves. One of the interesting demographic and social changes amongst the millennial generation and subsequent generation after them, of course, Generation Z, there were those born between 1997 and 2010, is that they are obviously doing things a lot later in life. They are becoming adults approximately 8 to 10 years later than their parents' generation. So they're having kids later, they're getting married later, they're finishing their education later, they're leaving home later, they're sometimes returning back home when their rent is too high or they can't afford a house and they're saving up for a deposit. They are basically going through a process of arrested development, okay? Now that's pretty obvious, but what that says to me is that millennials and Generation Z are actually already living a multi-stage life. They are already rejecting the 3-stage life. They are being groomed culturally, economically, and psychologically for a longer life expectancy. But they are doing it in different ways. So everything that you find annoying about your millennial colleagues and your millennial children, whether it's trying to find a purpose in their job, whether it's changing companies every 3 years, whether it's only doing short-term saving rather than long-term investment, is proof, in my view, that actually they're thinking about their life in a multi-stage journey rather than a 3-stage phase. So just to endorse what Linda says. So I think that's the first thing, is this process of arrested development that's already underway is proof, I think, that millennials and Gen Z are moving in that direction and in the right direction. The second thing is the success of people's longevity is going to be determined by their multi-generational relationships. So whether it's, and this is already happening, so whether it's your ability to have children and to provide childcare is determined by your multi-generational relationships. Guess who's looking after my 18-month-old son right now? Yes, my mother. Your ability to finance your education, determined by your multi-generational relationships, i.e. the bank of mum and dad. Your ability to basically live to a secure and fair and comfortable old age, i.e. social care, is ultimately determined by your children's willingness to look after you in old age, or at least fund that social care. So a longer life expectancy, I think, puts ever more pressure on multi-generational relationships. And we are now closer and have more in common across the generations than ever before. You may think that that's not true if you look at politics, or perhaps you look at your own family, but it's absolutely true. There are more multi-generational households in the UK than there have been since the Second World War. The increase in multi-generational households in the US has increased by 30% in 8 years, and that's not just in immigration families, that's across the ethnic board. So multi-generational landscapes, multi-generational Internet of Things, multi-generational Alexas, multi-generational finances is the future. And my final point, and this goes back to a sort of comment that was made by Linda this morning about how we are moving into a process of having the freedom and the competency and the ability to redistribute our time. We're going to be living longer. We can have, perhaps midlife sabbaticals, or perhaps a period of volunteering, or going back into education later in life. The one part of your life that does have a fixed time is your fertility. And that isn't going to change unless we invent the male womb, or we basically undertake a mass freezing of women's eggs. Now, global fertility has decreased by 50% since 1960, and women are, for several reasons, having fewer children. But one of the big challenges is and this is for men and women, is to allow women to have children earlier. I do lots of focus groups with young people, particularly those in their early 20s, and one of the things, and surprising things I've encountered, is a lot of women seeing their mother's pressures, their mother's narratives, their mother's stories, and thinking, I want to have kids younger. And I was doing some work with a legal firm, top legal firm, a couple of weeks ago, and one of the interesting things the HR representative said to me is she said, we get a lot of young women in their early to mid-30s saying, can I be a lawyer and a mother? Women are thinking about their fertility because of their mother's example, because of the media panic, a lot earlier than previous generations. So I think there's all sorts of interesting changes afoot, and I think ultimately the younger generations are already there, much further than you think.
Robert, what is the philosopher's perspective on longevity and just these challenges that we've covered so far?
Well, a philosopher's perspective, I'm afraid I had to bring the mood down a bit. So I know it's the end of the day, we're going to have a drink soon and so on, but there are some darker things which need to be brought into the discussion. So if you want to go for a drink now, early, while I talk, that's fine. Longevity is the subject we're here to talk about. And longevity is about the extension of life. It's not about the stopping of death. And no matter how long we live, we'll still have to deal with the fact of mortality. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this for a couple of minutes. The two most important, or probably the two most celebrated philosophers on the subject are Aristotle and Montaigne, probably. Now, Aristotle says, actually, you don't know if you've lived a good life. Probably it's not really for ourselves to know whether we've lived a good life. Only other people can tell that about our lives, and probably after we've died. So a life can only be understood once it's finished and once other people are talking about us. But
that's bad news for this panel then.
bad news for the panel. But it helps us to think about the whole life, which I think is important and has been a theme for today. What Montaigne says, and one of his most sort of famous phrases, in French it's philosopher, c'est apprendre à mourir. So to philosophize is to learn how to die. Now, you don't have to be a philosopher to sort of get engaged in that, but you can think about this subject not from the perspective of how do you live a good life, but how do you live a good death? You know, how do you live it in such a way that it will be good? And of course, it's a bit like, you know, anything else. If you start with the end point and work back, you know, you begin to think rather differently. What would be a perfect death? I mean, is it something you wait until you're near that point anyway to think about, or do you think about it, I'm 53, do I think now about what would be a good death? How would that change, you know, what I'd be doing today or tomorrow and so on? And I was thinking about that research, which some of you probably know, came out a few years ago by this nurse who was involved in palliative care. You know, she interviewed all these people about their regrets as they're approaching their last few days. And of course, they may have adjusted their responses to, you know, to sound good. But I'll just read out the top 5 that came up in the survey. And the first one was, I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself. First one. Second one, I wish I hadn't worked so hard. Third one, I wish I'd had the courage to express my feelings. Fourth, I wish I had stayed in touch with my friends. Mm-hmm. And fifth, I wish I'd let myself be happier. None of them is saying, I wish I'd invested in my pension earlier, or I'd done that extra master's in economics. Now, all of those things are valuable, you know, but that's, you know, we think of those things as valuable when we start at this end of the telescope, you know, from the age we are looking forward. So I guess what I'm really saying, you know, from a philosophical point of view, is what if we turn the telescope around the other way? You know, if we imagine ourselves at the point of death, which is still, as far as we know, inevitable for all of us, it's an existential fact. How does that adjust, you know, how we feel about our lives now? And it doesn't actually have to be morbid at all. I think it can actually be quite a beautiful thing. And certainly when you read that research, I think that's what's most striking about it.
Marie-Elsa, you must deal with lots of existential questions on your daily obviously dealings as a priest with people. Do you have anything to share on this? Maybe continuing on the theme that Robert actually picked up on mortality.
Yeah, I was emailed and asked to talk about death. You just did. I don't know what I can add to what you said, but it's quite. You're right. Those interviews are things that I experience a lot. Mm-hmm. Obviously, being a priest for 15 to 20 years, I've sat by many bedsides of people who are about to die. Can you hear me? I tell you what, I'm going to do that. Is that better? Because I know I've got a ridiculously low voice. There's not a lot I can do about that. So I've, you know, been a priest 15 years, Jesuit, Ignatian spiritual director for about 10 years before that. So I've seen a lot of ritual. I think the only thing I could talk about it for an hour and we'd only just be beginning, but from what I've seen, firstly, I've worked in communities that are very much like the communities you've described, the new communities where people are breaking the ideas, the concept of how we should be at different phases of life. But I have to say, in my experience, we enter different phases of life at different ages because life happens to us in different ways. And I've worked with people in the kind of culture that you're describing, and I've also worked with many people who might be different generations living in their same house, but it's because they all need that income. No one's dependent on parents. The parents don't have any money. So there's a massive poverty in this country as well, which is something to bring into our equation of what it means to have a long life. Do we keep separating out as a community? Or is there a way of allowing history to feed us, to help us build on wisdom, to understand that we are inevitably and inseparably part of a community, that we do not live without each other, and even when we separate ourselves by will, we feel the separation. So perhaps there's something about being able to have a history that we remember, that we can build on, rather than having clean slates over and over again and not building on the shoulders of people who have passed on great wisdom before us. And I think that living that old kind of folk tale of living with death as your advisor can be, and only can be, but can be, a great culture and tradition to bring into our children. And every tradition that I've studied, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, folklore, we have these amazing tales about how to befriend that rite of passage, birth, marriage, death. Somebody, and I can't remember what author it was, talked about death as an arranged marriage. And there's something about being able to be honourable to oneself and to know that whatever archetype helps you go through, whether it's getting onto a great ship, whether it's not going quietly into that good night, whether it's seeing it as Yeats' Sleep, or Shelley's brother Sleep, isn't it? It depends on what it is that comes from your culture or what touches you, but investing in time to really think about that is worthwhile. And I would say that in my experience, when I have seen a culture become far less Christian, which is okay. I mean, lots of people are against religion now because they see what it does when it becomes political. Although for me, I'm fighting hard to try and keep the soulful and the spiritual, and to say that a life without that is throwing away the grace because of the potential corruption, and anything that comes in human hands, no matter what it is, will be tested. But whatever it is that you find or you have in your heritage, so that it's deep in your unconscious, whatever it is, can be passed on to your children and your grandchildren, but also taken ourselves to help us through. And it often is archetypal, poetic, or ritualistic, because it's something that you enter into with so many words and so much to say and so much yet unsaid. And that's why doing a kind of weekly ritual or an annual pilgrimage is so useful, because not only does it help us review our lives and go into the next stage, whatever stage that's going to be, and ask the question, am I really doing what is authentically right for me to doing, or am I racing into life and actually forgetting? And those things, if we do that throughout life, when we come to the death, it's just another, but it's a big one.
Esther, we talked a little bit about loneliness earlier, and I know obviously as we live longer lives, we don't know how much of that life we will be living alone. So I know loneliness is a big issue that you're trying to tackle with the Silver Line, but what can we do to support older people more in society, and how do we create more empathy with older people?
Such a terrific question. I find myself very uncomfortable with what you've said. Because I think even in old age, life should be worth living. I want briefly to tell you about Margaret, because I've never met her, but I feel she's a friend of mine. And the Silver Lion started in 2013, November, not quite 5 years old. And she wrote very soon after that, I just had to put pen to paper. I love her because she typed it. I just had to put pen to paper to say a huge thank you to the Silver Lion. There must be so many folks like me who are benefiting from this service to explain. I've been part of a Silver Circle group. That's conference calls we do. It's a telephone service. We do letters as well, but it's not face-to-face. Silver Circle group for only a few weeks. And also I have a Silver Line friend, that's trained volunteers, who match with callers. And already I look forward to a blether, she's Scottish, with my new friends. I can thoroughly recommend Silver Line. It certainly lights up my week. How fascinating and so interesting to listen and discuss so many topics. We oldies do still have lots to offer, yet at this stage in life it can be lonely. At times we seem to be regarded as second-rate, a bit of a nuisance, yet we have all the experience of life, been useful and busy. Indeed, I do hate to be patronised. So I talked to Margaret a little bit about her circumstances. She was in her early 80s then. She was living not alone. She was living with her husband, a little older than she was. He had dementia. She said to me, it's a very quiet house. She has children, but they live a long way away. Does she talk to them? Yes, they ring her from time to time. Because of the Silver Circle, the conference call, they were chatting, just chatting, and she discovered, A, she doesn't use a computer, but Sainsbury's will deliver groceries to you if you ring them up and order it. She didn't know that. The other thing she discovers is that one of the other people, a wee lassie, she says, on her Silver Circle, also suffers, as Margaret does, from agoraphobia. She is literally a prisoner in her home. And she and the lassie discussed the daft excuses that they both make to friends to explain why they can't go out. So I spoke to Margaret on Saturday, and I asked her, what was her dream? And she said, you mean when I was young? I said, absolutely. She said, I wanted to be a ballet dancer. And she told me that her dance teacher was putting on a show, but didn't have, she was one dancer, let her down in the chorus. They had to be 16. Margaret was 14. The teacher said, don't dare tell them your age. So she didn't. She didn't have tights, couldn't afford tights, so she put tan, I think it was number 9, she told me, stick on her legs, and she was so proud of it, she went to school the next day wearing socks and number 9 tan. So her voice lilted when she was talking to me about it. And I said to her, so what's your dream now? And she said, to go to sleep and die peacefully in the night. And I said, what? And she said, that's what we talk about all together on the conference call. And all she has now to look forward to is that conference call she does with the Silver Line on Mondays. Now, in the 6 years she looked after her husband, she ended up doing everything for him, dressing him, washing him, and then he had to go to a nursing home, which he really did not want to do. So I said, why? Well, she said it got very silly in the end when I was washing him. It was a question which one of us would fall over first. She's 87 now. Okay, so the Silver Line provides company. Not face-to-face company. Company by phone, by letter. But we don't have the funds to guarantee that we'll be there in a year's time. Why not? Because older people do not have the pull on people's generosity and compassion that dogs do, that cancer does, that, thank heavens, children do. When we launched Childline in 1986, I was inundated with donations to the public. I remember a widow sent her wedding ring. She said it was all she had of value. She didn't have any money. When we launched the Silver Line in November 2013, we had to rely on corporates who work with older people and understand the need and respect and love their customers, and on charitable foundations. So what can we do to deal with what has been described as this epidemic of loneliness? I said to Margaret, she lives in sheltered housing. I said, don't you have neighbours? She said, oh yes, I do see them walking by. Do they ever ask the question why this lady, who for 6 years had a centre to her life looking after her husband, and now he died in September, so she is absolutely alone. Don't they ask questions? How has she fallen through the net? She has agoraphobia. Surely her doctor knows this. Those children, I'm not criticizing her children, but she said they ring her from time to time. It's not enough. We have to sensitize ourselves to the fact that before death comes, and it's what she is now dreaming of, a peaceful death, there are people who deserve better from us. I love Margaret. She does not complain. I had to pull these facts out of her. She wrote to thank me.
It strikes me that perhaps the children and perhaps those in midlife are faced with the burden of potentially dealing with, obviously, older parents, but also looking after children, to pick up on Eliza's point, who are growing up a lot less faster, perhaps, living with their parents and expecting certain things until they've reached their adult life a lot later than perhaps previous generations.
Yeah.
What do you think about this, and what is your own perspective on how you, as a mid-adult, face up to these challenges?
Well, it struck me when you were speaking that midlife is the exact opposite of that older stage of life, because you are the opposite of lonely. You are so busy. I mean, if there's one word that sort of sums up the 40s, it's busy, busy, busy. At one point, I looked at the to-do list that I've been keeping on my computer, and I realized it was 11 pages long. And it's having children later, at least for my generation, though I highly recommend having them at 24. It's your parents getting older and wanting to call you to talk about their hips and their knees and their doctor's appointments. And it's the fact that you're at the earnings peak of your career. So you actually want to put the pedal to the metal, as we say in America, and earn. When I was looking into the research on midlife, the researchers were saying that they can't get subjects for midlife studies because the people are too busy to participate in studies. Old people go to studies, and college students are very available. So the big skill in midlife is triage, basically. Learning how to say no to things, learning what you want to do and what you don't want to do. And I think for women, it's about learning to be a little bit ruthless and to learn how to disappoint people and to live with the consequences of your decisions, but knowing also, because maybe you have contact with people who are slightly older, that this too shall end, and that you will enter a period when you will go to the movies again one day.
Eliza, how do the value drivers of the millennials and Gen Z in particular fit in with these challenges that we've outlined, both in midlife and in later life? Are they oblivious to these challenges? Are they too self-absorbed, as we keep hearing? Or
no, I think the unfair and attack on the self-indulgent, privileged millennial generation is somewhat overdone and unfair. And it's often articulated by baby boomers, who are, as we know, the true privileged generation in terms of their benefits and life experience. I think there's a number of things that, first of all, millennials, who are, by the way, not young anymore. They are now managers, they are now parents, they are now savers, investors. They are well into their career, well into their life, and are reaching the mid-stage and mid-pressures. And they are very different from Generation Z. Generation Z, just for a bit of context, they're the generation who can't remember MySpace. They're the generation who cannot remember a time before there wasn't a black president of the United States, when China wasn't an economic superpower, when the economy, particularly in the UK, but across the West, wasn't associated with austerity. They are the true recession generation, and it's conditioned them accordingly. So there was a study done by Harvard Business Review that said that 70% of Generation Zers make their own pocket money. And they're not doing the traditional kind of, bar work or newspaper round of former generations and former young people. No, they're buying and selling stuff on eBay, apps like Depop, they're making music videos, they're selling their own skills, they're tutoring. They know their life is going to be one big hustle, and they're starting early. And they are also actually saving and thinking about their long-term financial future. They are also questioning the point and the price of college and university education, and are thinking very differently about how they want their lives to pan out. I was doing a focus group with a group of Generation Zers, and they said, basically we're determined not to be millennials. So these are your new graduate recruits, these are the students in your universities, and these potentially are your children, and they're very different from millennials, and it would be a great disservice to them to confuse the two. I think what collectively anyone under 35 is looking for is, firstly, education institutions need to be like banks. Everyone needs to have a lifelong learning account and has to be able to top up their skills, their education, both soft and hard skills and qualifications. That is, in the age of automation, an absolute necessity. And it is absolutely bonkers that we have this situation now where we squeeze all of our education into those sort of years of, up to the age of 21, and then live with the debt of it really up until the age of 40. And it's been an absolute educational trend that I think needs to be monumentally reversed, because it's not serving young people or the next generation of workers well. I think secondly, one of the things I've noticed with millennials is fathers. The way in which fathers are now seeing their parental duties much more seriously and much more profoundly. I was doing a focus group with a group of late millennials, so the ages of sort of 35 to 40, and there were 3 dads in that group, and one of them worked at a bank, one of them was a lawyer, and one worked for a PR agency. All 3 had taken paternity leave between 3 months and 6 months. All 3 had to threaten to resign in order to get not only paternity, but a bespoke, flexible deal of working hours and timetable post-paternity leave. And one of them actually was told by his boss, oh, well, I'm guessing you're not going to expect any form of advancement or promotion in the next 3 years then if you do this. And I was like, welcome to the world of women in workplace, because that's what women have been facing and enduring for decades. So I think millennial fathers are ironically going to enable millennial mothers and the whole kind of parenting work-life balance issue to really take a new development and a more sophisticated shape, and hopefully a healthier shape. Because as Linda pointed out earlier on, actually the period at which you have kids, if you're living to 100, is actually quite a short space and condensed time in your life, and why not enjoy it to the full? Because boy, do you need to give them that attention in those early years.
And Robert, what is your perspective on this intergenerational tension that I can feel building up? And do you think it will, are you optimistic or pessimistic as our ability to cope and live together?
Can I answer a different question?
You're such a philosopher, you question the question.
Exactly. Can you ask me a question about loneliness instead?
Please talk about loneliness.
Thank you.
Yes.
I wanted to pick up on what you were saying about loneliness, actually, because it's very hard not to resonate with what you're describing there and with stories like that. And clearly, when we talk about loneliness, we think about solutions, and the solutions we nearly always default to are putting older people into contact with other people, so there's more physical contact. And it would be daft to disagree with that. I 100% agree with that. But that seems that the answer to loneliness is to be found outside the self rather than inside the self. And I want to just say a little bit about this because I'm on the board of a psychoanalytic organisation. It's called the Tavistock Institute of Medical Psychology. I do a lot of work with psychotherapists and psychoanalysts and so on. And I guess what I'm always surprised by is, when we have board meetings or whatever, how many of the psychotherapists or the psychoanalysts report back and talk about how underpopulated people's inner worlds are in so many cases, because they don't have the tools for inner exploration. They're not emotionally articulate about their own experience. And we know, a lot of old people, depending on their stage of memory, will be nostalgic and will look back to the past and so on, have favourite memories, even if those memories have become sweetened or corrupted or whatever they might be. but they're not always supplemented with the tools for self-reflection. And I think if you can provide those tools of self-reflection, understanding your life, suddenly you have a kind of inner universe to explore as well. Now, I'm not saying this is a substitute for human contact at all. It's not an argument against what you're saying whatsoever. But the fact is people will be spending more time on their own. And loneliness, as we've heard about in this report quite recently, actually affects teenagers as much, I think even more, as the report said, than it does older people. So kind of to pick up partly on your first question, kind of intergenerationally, there is a link in terms of loneliness between different generations. And yes, of course, getting different generations to interact with one another physically is important. But I would also make a plea for equipping people more with the tools of emotional literacy, introspection. And I don't mean introspection in the sense of kind of maudlin self-analysis, or just sitting in a corner and dwelling on your troubles. I mean the capacity to look back on your life, understand your life, spot patterns, spot relationships.
May I ask him a question? Because it would be really helpful. I think you know that loneliness erodes self-confidence. People think they're alone because nobody wants them, and also erodes identity.
Yeah.
And what Margaret has lost is being needed. She's not needed by her family. They've grown up, they've moved away. Now she's not needed by her husband because he's passed away, and he desperately needed her during those last 6 years. How do you replace that, which is clearly what made her feel valued?
I don't think you can replace it, and that's part of the process of grief. That's loss. It's not about replacement, but there are ways of understanding loss. So, for example, there's very famous work on the stages of grief. In order to understand what you're going through.
It was very annoying. Some lady, my husband had just died, and some lady gave me a list of what the emotions I had to go through. I said, is it all right if I get to violence quicker?
Well, that had a good effect. It woke you up.
Sure
it gave you something to react to. You don't have to agree with the way in which you're understanding the world, but you have new tools for understanding it. So that would be my answer to the question I asked you to answer.
Marie-Elsa, should we start to learn how to grieve sooner in life if the decline is inevitable?
Sorry, you suddenly made me a bit depressed here.
Decline is inevitable would be a difficult image to follow, and one that I wouldn't want to build on in any way. There are different phases of life, and yes, working out how to cope with different phases of life, the inevitable change, how to love, how to keep loving, how to love after loss. We learn that from very young. And if we're more overt about the culture of that, the depth of it, the art, the craft, the love, the spirituality, whatever word is useful, if we learn that there is a craft to life, there is a craft to loving, there's a craft to building community, there's a craft to respecting and really valuing the wisdom and gift and relationship with people in every phase of life. We're so frightened, I think, of the ending, and we're so focused on the building phase now in our culture that we've forgotten the self-reflection side, but also this sense of remembering, building community, and how to keep different types of life. It's hard to even go into that idea, because the idea that people can't keep working. My father's just about to turn 80, and he does the equivalent of 3 jobs because he's been allowed to. But he has to have checks with Sky TV regularly because of his age, even though he gets really good checks. So I guess they're keeping a check on him, but I come from a culture where there's been no phase of life where you stop learning. you're always going into a new phase. You're always pushing boundaries. You're always wanting to change things for a better. There's always a radical corner for you to face and look and see what you can contribute there. There's always more. But with that comes the danger of racing into the new without preparing, settling, digesting, growing, learning, and completing the phase before you go into the next one. And that is inevitable. It's inevitable that you can crash if you don't do that. Fly too high, you know?
I'll just say something about death. I lost my father 4 months ago, and one of the things I found quite strange as he entered the stage in which, you know, he was nearing the end of his life was that he much to our dismay, his 3 girls and his wife, he didn't really reflect on his life at all. I was expecting this kind of Hollywood-esque moment where we'd have this deeper, meaningful conversation about our relationship. It never happened. He was listing bits of furniture that shouldn't be sold. He was, you know, telling me what particular things that I should be doing next in my career. You know, there was actually very little reflection. But what there was a deeper connection to those that had passed than those that were still living. And obviously this caused great resentment from my mother, who was, you know, basically saying, I've been caring for you for 50 bloody years, bastard. But it's, and the thing that got me actually is that when he died, I felt exactly the same. Because I realised, and I, you know, someone who's become a mother and lost her father in the space of a year, I had a pull towards death in a way that I had not and have never had in my life. And I feel like as you get older, that draw to death, that connectivity to death and those that are obviously are no longer with us, just becomes more and more profound. And therefore I can absolutely relate to Margaret's, in some small way, dream of her dream now for just to not wake up one day and have a quiet death. Because actually, that's one of the profoundness of death, is that it gets you ever closer to that inevitable.
I want her to have a bucket list. I want her to say to me, I'd love to be able to something or other. That's what I wanted to have, because I want the quality of life, because she has so much to offer. One thing did strike me is volunteering. People can volunteer for the Silver Line without leaving the house, because they can become Silver Line phone friends. And I think that volunteering can give you back that feeling that you are valued, that you have made a difference, that your life still has a purpose. Because I hear what you say, and I'm always being told by my very spiritual elder daughter that I'm not spiritual. But I just want our older people, given the extra 25 years or so that we're donating to them, to feel those days are precious and valuable and, please God, sometimes fun. And if we can produce, if you, in this wonderful longevity forum, can create something, can we please find fun for our older people, so that when I ask this lovely woman what her dream is now, she has something in life to dream about.
But isn't that changing? I mean, baby boomers upload the most to Facebook, spend the most money on travel, technology, and probably avocados. They're living their millennial life right now. I mean, it's a generational shift in that baby boomers are currently redefining what old age and retirement means. It's not pipe and slippers. And actually, I think you are getting those bucket list baby boomers reliving their retirement. I think that perhaps fortunately, Margaret may be the exception as we go forward.
I'll tell you what it is. Active elderly. I'm active elderly. It seems to be a technical term. That's what I am. I hate elderly, but anyway, I'm told I'm active elderly. We are in denial. We know inevitably we're going to get more frail. We are. We don't think about it. We ought to think about it. We don't think about it. But the corners to the silver line are very often disabled. And health prevents them from doing those things, going on those long haul holidays, even going out to buy the avocado.
Can I just add something here? Is that we're not going to have much time to talk about it, but with a longer life, we're talking about a healthier, longer life, and therefore the phases will continue. So there's not this kind of isolated old age that we're condemning people to, which is hopefully will change the whole understanding of the many phases of life. And we'll all have different numbers of phases of life according to what happens. But if it is that it's a longer life, but we all have a longer time being unwell and needing care, then I suggest that it is profoundly important that we shift our understanding from about caregiving, because being a mother or being a caregiver is one of the greatest gifts you get. And there's nothing like that kind of love. And it's really very hard to receive when you're older and you are aware that you receive it. Or when you become dementia. My grandmother got dementia and she became childlike, but with the respect of an elder. But looking after her was extraordinary. But we don't value these things. So I suggest that if we have a longer life, we're going to have a look at how to care for people more, then the whole psychology of caring and the value of that side of our humanity, instead of just the building phase, does need to be brought into view much stronger. Don't you think?
Now we've run out of time, but I'd like to take a couple of questions from the audience, if there are any.
This is more of a comment than a question. It's straight back at you, Esther. My mother-in-law is in a care home where deeply disabled, completely paralysed people are taken ice skating. And one of them was asked what her wish list was, her bucket list, and she wanted to go skydiving. So the care home did no more than get a virtual reality set in and allow her to go VR skydiving. Now, I think that's what should be happening in our society. That's why we picked that care home. But there are very, very few places like that around. They encourage young people in, they have birthday parties, they have all sorts of interesting things going on.
I blame the media. I blame the media. I mean, God knows we all read about the terrible cases of neglect and abuse in care homes. Why don't we hear about wonderful examples of good practice? And that's absolutely right. When I was, unfortunately and stupidly, a candidate in the general election of 2010 in Luton South, heaven knows why, I did actually visit a care home there, and the staff said, why do people always talk about us as the last resort? We're providing a safe environment, company, entertainment for people who would otherwise be isolated. I'll get the name of your care home and store it for future reference.
There's a gentleman up there.
Thank you, great panel. Perhaps Esther, but maybe others. I think the commercial side is really interesting in terms of getting those entrepreneurs, making the VR, making the cool tech solutions. It's certainly an area that I'm passionate about. Your point of 2 million phone calls is fascinating. I wonder if we can connect those entrepreneurs and commercially minded businesses to some of those people. I know it's very delicate. You don't want to be in the business of pushing products, but on the other hand, you've got a very powerful distribution mechanism. The single biggest challenge that I get told by the 3,000 or so startups that we track on a global basis is they can't get to older people in their homes. And they've got all these great ideas, like all these products. There's no distribution mechanism, no awareness. And it's what you've got potentially, and Age UK and others, nobody's doing it, is connecting the dots and creating a distribution channel for ideas and potentially new businesses.
Would you do a small product placement on your calls?
It's a very difficult subject, because obviously we are providing friendship. We never want to be accused. We're 24/7, you know, open all through the night, open over Sundays, etc. We never want to be accused of grooming people in order to exploit their wallets. So it's very difficult. But I hear what you say.
One final question, and single answer, if I may. Looking at to 2050, are you optimistic or pessimistic about our ability to adapt to longer lives? optimistic?
Well,
or
I'm
pessim-
American, so I'm
optimistic?
absolutely optimistic. Yeah.
Well, I'm 78. It's your problem.
Eliza?
I think about my son, and I'm going to teach him 3 things: to dance, because robots can't dance, they can't even get upstairs; to cry, because that's empathy; and to concentrate, because we're all over distracted.
Well, there's got to be some balance, hasn't there? So, pessimistic, obviously.
Marie-Elsa?
Hopeful.
Hopeful. Excellent. On that note, thank you very much for joining us today.